Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024. Happy 4th of July Eve. Today we're going to be taking a look at a 2024 presidential election prediction between Vice President Kamala Harris and President Donald Trump. A showdown that was entirely unexpected and is coming to consideration as many top Democrats now question, should President Biden be at the top of the ticket? And it looks like the conversation has geared more towards a replacement nominee right now. A lot of the media speculation right now for President Biden is really just considering who's going to replace him if he does decide to step down. Now, the White House has confirmed, and I want to start off by saying this, the White House has said multiple times that he will not be stepping down. President Biden on a campaign call today said he would not be stepping down as the top of the ticket here. And so a lot of this media speculation really seems to be rooted in exactly that, speculation. But that doesn't mean we can't explore the possibility of a Vice President Harris nomination for the VP spot for the presidential spot for 2024. Especially with all these news articles talking about how she would be the top choice to replace Joe Biden if he does step aside. So, of course, it's helpful to take a look at where she might stand against President Trump in a 2024 election matchup. Now, first things first, I want to take a step back and look at the prediction I made just yesterday on the 2024 race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. A head-to-head matchup that puts President Biden at 226 electoral votes and former President Trump at 312. And so clearly here, that is a decisive victory, a very strong one for the former president and one that should not be ignored by national Democrats. Granted, we are 4 months out. We are less than a week since that debate. I know it feels like an eternity given the amount of discourse and news we've seen from the Supreme Court to the debate to everything else happening in American politics and in international affairs. And so this is where we stand, 312 to 226. And so the fundamental question will be, does Vice President Harris do better? And so we'll be exploring that as we get through this video, looking at areas where she might have a unique appeal to different regions of the country and other parts where she may have potentially some detriments to a campaign, may perform worse, may not do as well in some parts. And so really what this is going to do is just unpack where we are in the state of the race. If Kamala Harris was to be subbed out for Joe Biden in this race, or Joe Biden was to be subbed out for Kamala Harris, and what that would look like on the national map. Here we are. 538 toss-up electoral votes. We have yet to characterize a single one. As we do, we characterize our safe states, states that we know Democrats or Republicans are going to win regardless of who the nominee is. And so what that looks like right now are states like Maryland and California and Oregon and Washington. These are states where we generally have an idea that, you know what, Democrats are going to win here. There's no consideration that Democrats do not. And so at a similar baseline, very similar to what we saw for President Biden in the most recent prediction, yesterday's prediction, the map here is roughly 180 electoral votes for the Democratic Party. Moving on to the Republicans, they have quite a few as well. States like Utah and Wyoming and North and South Dakota, Nebraska at large, and of course, states in the South like Alabama. These are states, all around that are very locked in for the Republican Party, even if they do end up narrowing down just slightly by 2 points, 3 points to being likely. It's not worth the discourse, and it really is up in the air right now. And I would honestly say, based on the national average between Trump and Biden, based on the national average between Trump and Harris, we can reasonably conclude that all of the states have characterized as safe red and safe blue are going to be characterized as such. So here we are, 181 electoral votes for Vice President Harris, a change slightly. Donald Trump had 125 in my last prediction, but President Biden actually had 180, so one electoral vote less. That came from Maine's 1st District. The idea here is that with a consolidation of more Democratic support, Maine's 1st District, in addition to potentially some other parts of the country that are reliably Democratic but need to be pushed there in terms of enthusiastic turnout, could happen in states like Maine, but it also runs a risk in some of these battleground states, and we'll explore that in this video. So moving on, we have what we now characterize as likely states. We've gone really quickly through the safe states. All you need to know is that those states, no matter what happens, no matter who you nominate, will go to either respective party. Now, likely states are ones that, in some weird circumstance, could reasonably go to the opposition party. For instance, for an example, if I was to say Kamala Harris was likely to win Kansas, there is a circumstance in which Donald Trump does, in fact, win Kansas. But it isn't this one where it is the likeliest outcome, nor is it probable. It is something that could happen given a major swing, given some type of massive reduction in support that is well within a reasonable expectation, something like a 2008 style of victory for either side of the aisle. But right now is pretty safe for the, in this circumstance, Kamala Harris. For a realistic example, a likely state that we would see is something like Maine at large, a state where we know it's going to go to the Democrats, but given its history, could theoretically go to the Republican Party. Now that we're moving on and understand where that is, it's anywhere between 5 and 15%. Let's go ahead and characterize some of our likely Democratic states and some of our likely Republican states. Now, based on where we are, I would like to start off with the likely Republican states because Donald Trump is coming in from a bit of a deficit. 125 electoral votes is not the best place to start off. But with these likely electoral votes, he gains quickly. We start off with the states of Ohio and Iowa, which vote pretty much together and are reasonably going to be Donald Trump states, regardless of who the Democratic nominee is going to be. Anywhere from an 8 to 13-point margin of victory, these are locked in for Trump. Ever since the Obama era, Donald Trump has tapped into maxing out the rural turnout there for himself. Also doing quite well in some of the areas that Democrats used to do well in. Not necessarily exactly rural areas, but white working class suburban areas, white working class urban areas, where you find that historically Obama and his coalition, even John Kerry, did well in. Al Gore did better than Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, and now seem to be Trump country, even if in some cases they are registered Democrats, they vote for Democrats like Sherrod Brown. We could see a circumstance in which Democrats are winning the Senate race in Ohio, but Trump is winning the state by 8 or 9 points. And so that really, again, all up in the air right now, given where we are between Biden and Trump, but in this situation is a little bit more probable because of the fact that we would likely see a marginally better response for Kamala Harris in states like these, but not enough at all to make any type of difference. And, more on that as we get later on in the video. Other states that we would find actually not a state, the states of Maine and Nebraska get to allocate their electoral votes based on congressional district as well as an at-large vote. Maine's 2nd district here would go to the Republicans, likely red. We would find that one would be pretty easy for President Trump. One here in 2016, one here in 2020, not going to change. The next two states are ones that Democrats have really been fighting for quite some time. Haven't been able to win Florida since 2012, have not been able to win Texas since 1976. Neither of which are going to Democrats this election. Florida and Texas are two states that the Republican Party sort of realized as an oh crap moment that these states are within contention. Florida has always been, but Texas far more recently. In 2020, Biden lost the state by 5.6. In 2018, Beto O'Rourke lost the state by 2.8. These are two Democrats who ran statewide campaigns, and we saw that on the presidential level, Republicans performed better, but on the Senate level, they performed significantly worse. Point being, this is a state that, in theory, in the next 10 to 20 years, could go to the Democratic Party, and with its 40 electoral votes, is comparable to a state like California. If Republicans lose it, everything gets thrown out. The National Party platform, their coalition, all of it gets thrown out because it means they need to appeal to different parts of the country that they aren't typically reliant on for victory. It also means, too, they need to find more pathways to victory. Because what we've seen as a noticeable trend is that, generally speaking, when states vote blue once, in 21st century at least, very often they continue this trend line of becoming more and more Democratic. We've seen some states have a reversion on that, like Iowa and Ohio, but at the baseline, especially Georgia and Arizona, we're starting to see that become more apparent. With that being said, though, Texas, Florida, Kamala Harris's candidacy doesn't change anything about those states. Florida's going to go to Trump. That's his home state. He's very popular there, and he does well there. Did well in 2016, did well in 2020. Democrats lost there in 2022, but get this, 19 points in the Senate race, 20 points in the governor's race. That is how Florida has become so far to the right, not to mention that on roughly a 90 to 10 split, we see that those who moved into Florida because of COVID laws in states like New York and California were far often Trump supporters, conservatives, Republicans. That's huge. You're talking an influx of hundreds of thousands of people across the country who are moving into Florida because they want to escape what they believe are draconian COVID laws. The type of person to do that probably isn't a Democrat. And so we saw there a huge ideological split, 90 to 10, 80 to 20, whatever you want to cut it down. Republicans saw a huge electoral benefit from it. So Florida, Republican, Texas, Republican, Iowa, Ohio joined the ranks. With that, we have finished our likely Republican states, bringing Donald Trump up to a whopping 219 electoral votes to Vice President Harris's 183. The good news for her, she has some states that we can characterize as likely. The state of Colorado is the first state we characterize as likely. In my most recent prediction, that is also the only state I characterized as a likely Democratic state. But Kamala Harris offers a regional advantage to the western part of the United States, and it isn't just that she's from California. Kamala Harris, in 2020, seemed to have added amongst minority Americans for a Biden winning coalition. She brought in a huge chunk of, members of different congressional coalitions. I mean, you're talking about the Congressional Black Caucus. You're talking about the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. You're talking about Kamala Harris, really reaming this in about how the Democratic Party has been the party about the American people, who looks like and works for the American people. The same point that we've been talking about here. Kamala Harris made history as the first black woman to be vice president, first Asian woman to be vice president, first woman to be vice president in general or in the executive as president or vice president. And that was a very big deal. But it cannot be understated that she inspires bases that President Biden on his own maybe wasn't able to. President Biden does do well amongst core Democratic constituencies. You're thinking South Carolina, you're thinking Alabama, you're thinking Mississippi in the Democratic primaries in 2020, where that really is what saved his presidential campaign. President Biden's very strong, ability to appeal to black voters, especially deep-rooted in the Democratic Party, that is what won him the primary. With that being said, turnout is also a major part of it too. You can inspire a Democratic base that is always going to vote, but what you may not be able to inspire is a base of people that sure would vote for you if they decided to vote. What Kamala Harris, I think, adds to this ticket, as the top here being on the presidential level, is that she does turn out minority Americans, I think, to a higher degree. I think we will find that while 2020 was record-breaking turnout, and I don't think anything will top that, at baseline in this election, even though we will have no way of comparing it, she may do marginally better, which could make a huge difference in some states. Now, I don't think that's the whole election. I really, really don't. And you have to keep in mind that Kamala Harris would likely choose a very strong choice as her vice presidential candidate. People like Andy Beshear or Josh Shapiro, somebody who is a blue state governor or a red state governor or a swing state governor who knows how to win an election and has won an election that was hard fought. Josh Shapiro, Andy Beshear are perfect examples of that. That could balance that. Throwing that out of the equation, I still think she does well. I think she does a better job in inspiring Latino voters that might be baseline Democrats, but just aren't excited to vote in this election. That might be if she is at the top of the ticket, which means states like New Mexico sort of see a reversion back into the Democratic column. States like Virginia become a little bit more in favor of the left. Now, I will say that Virginia, New Mexico, and Colorado are sort of in a group together. Huge Latino population, huge Asian American population. And that matters with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. Equally, we have to look at this from the lens of, does she bring out white suburban voters in the same way that President Biden does? And the answer is maybe not. I think when we're looking at it from an analytical lens, what the big pitfall for her was in 2019 when she decided to exit the race is that she didn't have a winning coalition when it came down to the Democratic primary. A lot of the base she saw turn over in 2019 when she went after President Biden on the debate stage. You saw a 10-point shift upwards. She skyrocketed from 6th, 7th, 8th place to 3rd place nationally, 2nd place nationally, depending on what polls you were looking at. And the reason for that was because Biden took a huge dip. However, we have to take a look at this. You're talking about a dip that happened amongst a coalition of voters that President Biden was relying on that was primarily minority voters, primarily black voters. And so you do see that while Kamala Harris was able to take some of that portion, she didn't take down Sanders' base, which primarily was white progressives, white leftists. That's really what we saw. Also, in some cases, Latino voters, but that was pretty unique to the state of Nevada. Outside, we saw that Joe Biden was really running up those numbers in the head-to-head race, and so was Hillary Clinton in 2016. Again, not to get into the weeds of it all, but we really saw that divide there when it came down to the national. I think Kamala Harris does well amongst minority voters, and I do think that she could perform very well in some of these battleground states. I do, though, think there are concerns that maybe she doesn't appeal to white suburbanites the same way that Joe Biden does. That may be because he's someone who has had long-standing history in the United States Senate, also was part of Obama's coalition that also included those white suburbanites, that was something that they felt familiar with, that they felt was, the 2020 election, what they supported going into this race. And so I think, especially with the direct contrast with Donald Trump, Joe Biden offered that. The more, looking at this from the lens of, this is an older guy, someone who is more caring, someone who is more cautious, and looking at this from the lens of a more compassionate president. I think Vice President Harris does have all of those things, but she hasn't been branded that way. I think when you look at the duality between the two candidates, the 2020 election was a lot about positioning and using them two as a counterbalance to each other. She was a former prosecutor. She came into this as attorney general, became a senator, a rising star in the Democratic Party, more progressive, versus Joe Biden, known for his centrism, known for being vice president, being in the Senate for 40 years, being the youngest person in the Senate at the time, now the second youngest ever in United States history. They balanced each other. And on the baseline, when it came down to when you're looking at it from the perspective of just high level race, gender, Joe Biden committed to choosing a woman as vice president. Almost immediately, the campaign uplifted all that discussion that he would be choosing a black woman. That was the direct balance that Joe Biden needed, especially when the Democratic Party was talking a huge thing about how they were the diverse party, that they were going to represent America in more than just the administration, but also on the ticket. And Kamala Harris was the right choice. Again, this circles me back to the VP conversation about who she picks, because I think Josh Shapiro would be a very strong pick should she decide to look for a VP nominee. At the same time, I think her at baseline does not appeal to white suburbanites the way that Joe Biden does, which is why they were the perfect combination ticket together. So looking at where, beyond Virginia, beyond New Mexico, beyond Colorado, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, I do believe that we would see largely in line with what we saw in the Biden versus Trump prediction come to fruition. Now, she does do better in terms of, again, inspiring minority turnout. That would matter in an area like Philadelphia and Detroit and Milwaukee and Minneapolis. That cannot be ignored. And also, too, her positioning on hot button issues, especially hot button issues that matter to voters in Dearborn, Michigan, when you're talking about Gaza. Kamala Harris has been long seen as the more progressive, more left-leaning one on this topic. And so that's also a conversation that would be had amongst national leadership, amongst the White House, amongst Democratic strategists, but that could be a point, too, as to why she would do marginally better in a state like Michigan, but also lose some ground. And so moving outside of this conversation, I want to get into some of the lean states here, because I don't think there are that many likely states left. I think I'm looking around the map. I really can't come up with any. I think we're going to really move down to lean, where these are states decided between 1% to 5%, because that's really where we are. Remaining 108 electoral votes are going to be quite close. Kamala Harris would put up a good fight. Donald Trump would put up a good fight. It really just comes down to the margins, where we are as the current state of the race, between Biden and Trump, between Harris and Trump, what we would look at, and it looks like there are some advantages for both sides of the aisle. So let's get into it. I do think Donald Trump is going to win North Carolina again. I also think he wins Georgia. I think we would see reductions in support for Donald Trump compared to Trump versus Biden rematch, but equally, North Carolina and Georgia only went to Biden by 0.2. North Carolina went to Trump by 1. I don't see them flipping, and I think if Kamala Harris was to win this election, it would be by very, very narrow margins. Right now, I don't see that happening. I think Georgia and North Carolina are a little bit too far gone for the Democratic Party right now, but in a future election, 2032, 2028, even 2026, depending on who's president, Democrats could certainly win there in the governorship, in a Senate election. It just really is not meeting the moment right now in terms of what Democrats need in order to win the race, and that includes Vice President Harris. So that bumps up Trump to 251. Democrats, to their benefit, have states like Minnesota and New Hampshire, where we would see Kamala Harris do just as well as Joe Biden, potentially even better. When you're talking about boosting minority turnout, that matters. And I think you see that in some of these states. New Hampshire, not as much. One of the whitest states in the country, where this is a large reason too, where I think she really runs even with Joe Biden. In Minnesota, I think we would see a slight advantage, but regardless, not enough for me to bump it over into the, Harris plus 6, Harris plus 7 column that we saw for President Biden back in 2020. Brings her to 225. I also think she's winning Nebraska second. I had Joe Biden winning it too. It's really hard to see how they don't. The district has become a little bit more Republican, but still at baseline Democratic. I think we're going to find the Democrats end up performing as well. Nebraska second, Minnesota, New Hampshire, all at large, go to Vice President Harris. And so now we're down to this point. 226 for Kamala Harris, 251 for Donald Trump. Kamala Harris is exactly where Joe Biden was in yesterday's prediction. Doing better in Virginia, doing better in New Mexico, doing better in Colorado, and doing better in some of these states. The margins may not directly show it, but she is doing better in some of these states. But at the same time, I could see her performing at where Joe Biden is in some of these other battleground states. And so swooping that in altogether, that would mean a state like Wisconsin, where I think Kamala Harris could narrow it down. You're talking making it a 1-point victory for Trump instead of 2 points or 3 points against Biden. I do think she has a huge benefit, again, inspiring and turning out a base. Minority voters, especially in Milwaukee, really, really, really matter. Hillary Clinton saw a huge decrease in turnout there in 2016, which was a huge reason for her loss. And Donald Trump, again, maxing out those rural areas. Wisconsin right now, I still think Trump would come out ahead, because it is still hard to see how in a matchup where she is down nationally by 2, that she ends up winning. That needs to be understood too. So Trump at Wisconsin, 261. Kamala Harris, however, I think could begrudgingly, based on what we've seen in the state, win a state like Michigan. Where voters there get to the ballot box, they're voting for Lisa Slotkin, they're voting for Democrats down ballot, and they get to the president, which would come first, but again, in their line of thinking, and say, I'd rather vote for Harris. You think about the communities in Dearborn that would feel more apathetic about voting for Biden than voting for Harris. They'd feel that it's more comfortable that they could hold their nose and vote for Harris in this election. Moving beyond that, too, you have to look at it from Detroit. You have to look at it where Democrats are consistently reliant on a Democratic voting base. Areas where Kamala Harris would do best. She has proven that she does well amongst minority voters in polling. She outperforms Biden in the most recent CNN poll in a head-to-head matchup amongst minority voters by roughly 9 points. That is substantial and should not and cannot be ignored if she becomes the nominee. That is where she does best, at least in our head-to-head matchups here. Michigan, I think, in this circumstance, would go blue. But Wisconsin, probably run even with Biden, but just marginally better. But the margins do matter in some states, like Michigan, not enough to flip a state like Wisconsin. And so that brings her to 241. She's already performing better than the president, but I don't think she performs that well. I think what we would find is that Kamala Harris would win a state like Nevada narrowly. With that being said, I think she would lose Pennsylvania and Arizona narrowly as well, which would ultimately put Donald Trump at 291 to Vice President Harris's 247. Nevada is a state where I think Kamala Harris knows, talking about similar regional advantages, she could do well here. I think also, too, again, when you're looking at the amount of unenthusiastic Democrats, Nevada would be an area where you would find that Kamala Harris could bring home a state that typically votes blue versus Arizona that sometimes votes blue. And it's harder to win a swing state that recently moved over than a state that you haven't lost since 2004. I think when you're talking about consolidation of the Democratic base, getting them back excited, getting them back ready to turn out and vote, something would have to dramatically change about the election. In this circumstance, it could be, very well could be, swapping out Vice President Harris at the top of the ticket to be the presidential nominee. In Arizona, though, I think it's a bit too far gone. In Pennsylvania, I don't think. She drives at the turnout numbers necessary to overcome where Donald Trump is right now. Recent polls show him up 3, 4, 5 points. Better than where it was pre-debate, and he wasn't already winning there, right? You didn't already see Biden winning in that state. I did have him winning it on the average here about a month ago, but things had certainly changed over the past month, even prior to the debate. That changed my evaluation, and even recently, I have Pennsylvania far more in the Democratic column. Republican column. I don't think it's enough for Harris to turn out enough of the base in Philadelphia. There are some instances where it just simply maxes out, and you don't get enough Democratic support across the state. And so there we are. Kamala Harris at 247, Donald Trump at 291. It's an election victory for Republicans, regardless of who they nominate, but one seems to be less of. And I think this is really going to be our running question here. And I haven't talked about it yet in this video, and so I want to take just a second to really unpack it. Is this just a snapshot in time for Kamala Harris to perform better than President Biden versus what is indicative for this coming November? To make that, I guess, easier to understand, because I honestly can understand how that's a bit confusing. Does Kamala Harris perform better in this moment, or does she perform better in November? Could a map like this be her maximum, but her maximum is what Democrats think they need right now, versus November where Joe Biden could win, but is losing by more by now? There's a risk here involved with keeping Biden on the ticket and also with swapping out Harris, and Democrats need to really evaluate that from a lens of electability. Not that many data points to work with, and it really is hard to gauge what the right choice is from the perspective of just polls. Because when you look at a map like this one, you might think it's clear. Kamala Harris has the higher chance. However, this could just be the maximum. This could just be where Kamala Harris is today and where she will remain for the next coming months if she is moved up to be the presidential nominee. So many things to keep in mind, and a question I want you guys to all go at home and think about. If you're thinking about, should Biden be replaced by Harris? Should Biden be replaced by somebody else? All of these questions should not come without a question of electability, and electability not just for now, not just for who can meet this moment, because it isn't the election. The election is in 4 months and 2 days. November is what matters. Could Biden eventually win in November, but look like he's being decimated now, versus Harris, who looks like she may do better now, but potentially could be decimated in November? Now, I'm not here saying that either of those two things are going to happen. I'm saying that's a question that many people are going to ask, because it's going to be hard to gauge. No numbers between Trump and Harris in over 4 years, except for the past 3 polls. Over 4 years, because she dropped out of the race. There hasn't been all this consideration and question around her being the nominee since the debate. And so all of this is new. All of this conversation and positioning and focus groups are so brand new, which means a lot of the data isn't vetted, isn't entirely trusted, and doesn't give a perfect answer. But I hope to contribute at least something meaningful. In that a hypothetical scenario between Vice President Harris and former President Trump, I have former President Trump at 291 and Vice President Harris at 247. A closer race, but also not without concern on both sides, for or against her, ones that Democrats will need to be weighing over the next coming days, next coming weeks, leading up to the convention, if this is truly the avenue they want to take, if they do decide to replace President Biden at the top of the ticket. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already. At the top of the screen, there's a Discord server for you to go ahead and join, and there's a video that you can go ahead and watch with a playlist of my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.